4 attacks in 3 months, 37 lives lost. Is Britain's counter-terrorism strategy inadequate, or is terrorism becoming impossible to police? This is Roundtable with me, David Foster. The attacks in London and Manchester were similar in style and all were the work of terrorists from different backgrounds and beliefs, but each was carried out by men who had been radicalised in different ways. Some were known to the authorities, a handful of names on a watch list alongside tens of thousands of others, too many to investigate, according to some. And with increasingly diverse paths to terrorism, it appears that would-be attackers are becoming harder to profile.
Move back!
Terror on the streets of Britain. In just 100 days, this country has witnessed attacks on an unprecedented level. Questions remain as to how these attackers managed to slip through the net, and there are fears now in Britain that terror could become the new normal.
You will never succeed in dividing our city.
We will take on and defeat our enemies.
Attention is shifting towards the security services, and details have emerged about how some of the attackers were on a terror watch list, but not considered a threat.
In light of what we are learning about the changing threat, we need to review Britain's counter-terrorism strategy to make sure the police and security services have all the powers they need. Enough is enough.
But how much is enough? British Prime Minister Theresa May says she wants tough new measures. They could include indefinite detention of suspects and more surveillance in Muslim communities. But there's already widespread distrust. The government's Prevent scheme aims to detect would-be terrorists early on, or those at risk of radicalisation. Muslim groups claim it's divisive and targets them unfairly because of their faith. The government says it's vital to protecting the country. But the distrust goes back to the policies of Tony Blair. His counter-terrorism strategy after the London bombings in 2005 was deeply unpopular among civil liberty groups. More than 10 years on, and the situation now is far more complex. The rise of lone wolf attackers who pledge allegiance to Daesh is a new challenge for the security services. The decline of the group in Syria and Iraq also means homegrown terrorists are more likely to stay and plan attacks on British soil. And there's extremism on all sides. Take, for example, the recent terror attack targeting Muslims leaving a London mosque. A counter-terrorism strategy would need to focus also on the rise of the far right in Britain. It's not yet clear when or if Theresa May will be able to push ahead with tough new measures. But it comes at a time when all of British society is feeling vulnerable, exposed, and worried about the future.
Well, Britain's motto is, in some cases, keep calm and carry on, but the recent attacks have left many people searching for answers. Is the government doing enough to investigate potential terrorists? Is its Prevent scheme futile? Is terrorism becoming too broad to police? To discuss this, I am pleased to say I'm joined at today's roundtable by Mohsin Beg, a former Guantanamo Bay detainee and now the outreach director for CAGE. Student activist Rahman Mohammadi, he was questioned under the UK's counter-terror laws after wearing a Free Palestine badge to school. Also at the table, criminal lawyer Mohammed Tasneem Akunji. Mr. Akunji has represented a number of families of individuals who've travelled to join Daesh, and Dr. Duane Menezes, director of the Human Security Centre and advocate of strengthening the UK's controversial Prevent strategy. Welcome to you all. Amber Rudd, Home Secretary, has said of Prevent, it is designed to support people at risk of joining extremist groups and carrying out terrorist activities. Sounds like a good idea to me. Who wants to start?
Initially, of course, when preventing violent extremism came in as a guide during the Blair years, everybody agreed with the idea that it's about preventing violent extremism. But what Prevent has done since it's become law in 2015 by the Tory government is essentially say that it isn't about preventing violent extremism, it's about recognising, identifying extremism points in people, and then trying to criminalise that or to put them through some sort of programme, through the Channel programme, and to de-radicalise them. Now, the problem is that they've done this through this amorphous view of British values that most people are simply unable to recognise. Nobody knows what British values really are. And if we just take one of those British values, by its definition, the British government would be called extremist. The rule of law. In my case, for example, I was held in Guantanamo without charge or trial, with the complicity of the British government. Senior ministers and former policemen have actually called, as your report said, for the reintroduction of internment without charge or trial. We're here in the land of Magna Carta celebrating just last year 800 years since the passing of the writing of this writ, which says, to no man shall freedom be delayed or denied, except that they'll be judged by a court of their peers. So if we start to use these measures in, by definition, we're becoming extremists because...
But let me throw this off to Dr. Menezes. The government says Prevent has its divided opinion. It agrees. It says it's working. 150 people, among them 50 children, were stopped from entering conflict zones in Iraq and Syria in 2015 because of the strategy. Does that mean it is working?
I think Prevent, by and large, is working. It's not a perfect system. It is an apple with sort of apple's cap on it, but I don't think the answer is overhauling it altogether. Yes, there have been, I think in the last few cases, I think 5 of the people responsible for the various sort of attacks in London and Manchester were people of interest, were people who had been reported by their communities or by friends to the authorities. So the problem there was not about were they being reported, was the system working, but about was enough being done about it. So I think Prevent is working, but there are issues with it.
Well, let's bring in Brockman. Yeah. I mean, you were questioned by police. You were wearing a badge that simply said Palestine on it. Has that helped you to steer away, if you like, from radical activities, or has it done exactly the opposite, perhaps?
I mean, the question I have is why does a Palestine badge automatically make you sympathetic with radical or extremist views? That's the question that I was asking. Why was it that that was wearing a Palestine badge, a Palestine wristband, or holding a Palestine leaflet? Why does that automatically make teachers assume that I'm radical? The only reasonable suggestion or answer.
So you were reported for wearing this. The fact that you were reported and then interviewed, did that make you angrier? Did that make you more or less likely to take on extreme views?
I think what Prevent can do, certainly in my case, obviously I wasn't a radical. I was just interested in the human rights cause of Palestine and Gaza. I think my faith and my background of Afghanistan and being a Muslim had a lot to do with me being targeted by Prevent. And I think that if someone was in that situation and they did have sympathies with extremist and barbaric groups such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda, then if you're alienated and targeted by your police officers, by your teachers, you wouldn't feel part of society. And that's the exact kind of people, young people, that ISIS prey on. If you're feeling alienated by society, not part of society, then you're going to look for alternative views, and ISIS will try and provide that.
Mr. Akunji, I mean, you've represented a number of families who've been charged with terror offences. Where do you think it's going wrong?
Well, I mean, the first question I have to the good doctor is what are British values, and should it be an almost criminal offence not to agree with every single one of them at every single point in time? And if that is the case, then what do we do about the DUP? Which is part of our government at the moment. So the problem with the whole issue of policing thought is policing thought, basically. That's the problem with it. In terms of should thinking or having opinions be criminalised or be of some serious concern, concern could be there, but the government isn't best placed to deal with these things. Where young people, particularly, for example, the 3 girls who went from Bethnal Green Academy, ran off to Syria, Prevent was fully implemented in that school and completely failed to identify them, basically. in that scenario, it would have been better for the teachers to be equipped to deal with them internally as a sort of critical thinking exercise, debating exercise, to give them the skills to identify polemic and propaganda themselves, rather than leaving it to a government who have a politicized angle on this policy.
I want you to kick it around amongst yourselves in just a moment, but let me ask you, Doctor, first of all, I mean, you work for 2 think tanks. Mm-hmm. Is policing thought, which is essentially what think tanks do, a problem?
Well, think tanks don't police thought.
No, but they think.
They think, yes.
They have thoughts.
Right. No, so the 2 issues I have, I need to put it out there, with Prevent myself, is one, the issue of British values. Now, I believe it should be reformed to make it sort of liberal, universal values, people that we can, the different communities actually share. So I would depart from this. Yes, I do think the flaw is, putting this term British, where we haven't really defined what British values would actually mean. The second be, again, focusing entirely on people, from an Islamic background. I think 1/3, if I understand correctly, 1/3 of the referrals made to the programme were from the, I think,
right-wing groups. But we'll talk about the number of arrests in relation to those referrals in just a moment. But you're right, a 1/3 of those investigated under Prevent.
Absolutely. So one of the arguments we make is, yes, the best way to get around the challenges that Prevent is posing is not by lightening the different measures being used, but by actually expanding it to include other groups that may have similar issues. So we need to look at ultra-right and ultra-left radicalisation, not just, we don't need to single out sort of the Muslim community or Muslim communities, but really look at where sort of terrorism or violent extremism is manifesting itself.
But what about people like Rahman, who reads about a cause, knows about a cause, perhaps knows people involved in it, and somebody snitches on him, if you like, because they don't like the way he's hanging,
I mean, I'm sorry to hear that. I mean, I don't think a badge saying Free Palestine, whatever one's views on the subject are, should necessarily get you into that
position. But isn't that the danger? It's a catch-all.
Well, yes, but we have to protect the national security of the country.
If you look at the statistics, just in 2015-16 alone, over 2,000 people were referred to Prevent, the majority of them children. There's children as young as 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and majority of the primary school children that have been referred to Prevent. But here's the question. They say this, you say the success of Prevent is stopping 150 people going to Syria. But the issue really is about saving lives in the UK. So my question is, how many lives has Prevent documented that it has saved in the UK? Because clearly, all of the cases that have been mentioned so far, not one of them Prevent got involved in. In fact, it was the communities, as you said, reporting on these. Prevent had nothing to do with it. Prevent didn't even come into the picture, and it will never come into the picture in preventing the attacks, which is what it's... Prevent was never built to stop people going to Syria, because the argument, again, in the report was, well, if they've gone to Syria, then the likelihood is that they'll probably stay there. With the powers that the Home Secretary has, they can stop them and have stopped them from coming to the country, etc. So the question isn't, we care about the security of people in Syria. We're supposed to care about the security of people here. So the question, again, is, how many lives has Prevent saved?
Well, so it's the question then, sorry.
Sure, no, go ahead.
No, it's the question then about how to...
That's very British, isn't it? After you. No,
yes.
After you.
Well, I try and live up to the values that I was brought up with.
Well, please.
Well, no, in terms of the statistics and the so-called successes of Prevent, well, the problem is Prevent and Channel are completely securitized. So they're not open to outside scrutiny. There aren't academics from outside of the Security or the Official Secrets Act that can look and comment on these things. And where we've got some indications in terms of actual speaking on the coalface, speaking to people who've been involved in Prevent, there are many so-called successes that were anything but successes. I've had clients who were stopped at the airport because the Prevent officers thought that the lady had too many pairs of underwear, which made it suspicious that she might be going off to Syria.
But the fact is that over the course of the last 3 to 4 months, we've seen more terror attacks in Britain than we've seen since 2005. More deaths caused by terrorism since 2005. So how do you go about changing the approach of people? Many of whom were brought up here.
It's quite simple, considering we're a country that have faced the threat of Irish Republican terrorism over the past decades. 3,000 people died in that conflict. But London was bombed right across, Manchester, Warrington, Birmingham. The deaths were I mean, they even targeted the MI5 building and and they nearly killed the Prime Minister. In the end, the process that we used was a discussion. It included...
It also included internment. And you've said about the Troubles,
actually, no,
you said the anti-terror measures and legislation during the Troubles in Northern Ireland were less than they are now.
No, no. What I said is that internment was the key driver in causing... You know, 25,000 people marched on the streets of Derry against that internment. The British soldiers opened fire on those protesters, and then there was a whirlwind of terrorism as a result of that. So internment actually created terrorism. So that's what we're talking about now. We've got senior former ministers, Tariq Kapoor, the former head of Met Police, actually saying that we need to reintroduce internment back in 2017 as a response to the terrorism attack.
Okay, so how do you change the situation we're presented with at the moment?
I think what Prevent does is it closes down conversation in schools and colleges. That's certainly what I experienced. I think if we want people to turn away from those evil ideologies such as ISIS and so on and so forth, we shouldn't stop them from talking about it. I think that the way to progress is to open those debates. Because right now, if you're in, for example, I was on a school trip and I mentioned the word ISIS, and my teacher said, I'm going to have to report that. And that's how silly it's become. If you open up these conversations about far-right extremism or so-called Islamic extremism, then people can be well equipped to battle those ideologies.
So it's as Churchill said, George or not, war, war.
Yeah,
but we also have... I mean,
it's an irony that Churchill said it. Yes.
I mean, just to bring in an academic spin here, I think it's important to move away from just looking at causes and consequences of radicalisation to looking at processes of radicalisation, to focus on the recruitment and the grooming and everything else. And then once you talk about that, it's also important to look at not just sort of radicalising and radicalised individuals, but looking at the radical milieu in which radicalisation occurs. And by radical milieu, what I'm trying to refer to is this immediate social environment, not macro, not foreign policy grievances, not micro, not individual senses of alienation, but sort of the immediate social environment which facilitates that radicalisation. And that means it means focusing on communities, focusing on networks, focusing on the internet. It means focusing on the substratum that are uniting the different groups, because terrorists, whether it's groups, individuals, and not free-floating entities, they operate in a context.
Can I introduce an element to this? Because we could talk for hours about it. Theresa May saying the current strategy isn't working, it needs to be changed, and she's talked about clamping down on the internet for one reason or another. And yet if you look at yesterday's front page, or the recent front page of the Times, it says her plans to fine companies such as technology companies are being compared to those of a Chinese dictator by her own counter-terror watchdog.
Well, it's not just that, it's a complete irrelevance, that is, because the government is at least a decade behind where the important sections of the public are. So if you clamp down on these companies, fine, you'll stem the flow in terms of the wider Google searching of this. But people just go straight to the dark web, which is
precisely the point he makes.
I would say this, that it's not even that. You've got something like WhatsApp or any other social media, and simple as this, somebody in Raqqa or Mosul, for example, he sends out a WhatsApp message after he's gone to a city that's been bombed by US coalition forces, which includes Britain. There are children, women, men, etc., Daesh or otherwise, civilians that have been butchered, I mean, literally killed by our bombing. He sends that WhatsApp message of the images. You don't need any more radicalization after that. All you have to do then is to make some sort of a connection. Does that individual feel connected to those people there? And we, as a society, will never address this, because essentially then we'll try to humanize our enemies.
Let me ask you a question. In 2014, you were arrested. There was a case almost brought against you, and in the end it was said that MI5 knew what you were up to. Yeah? Have you ever been asked, seriously, to advise on something like this, given your experience and the sort of things you've just said?
I've tried. I've been involved in hostage negotiation. The government has rejected that. I've tried. In fact, I've been arrested, and they tried to prosecute me for sending a generator to one of the Free Syrian Army rebels that the British government at the time was supporting with thousands of generators.
But has anybody said, Mohsen Beg, look, I mean, you know as much about what it's like to be on the receiving end of this kind of treatment.
I've spoken to people and I've offered support in the sense of that if you want to get in real dialogue, I've spoken to people within the government and they've said thank you but no thank you. And I understand why. Because it, by necessity, means the argument I'll present is that you have to address the issue of our own government's role in torture, in complicity in torture, in violations of human rights, in invading countries illegally, and you'll have to address that, because I won't come away from the table.
But don't you bring terrorism inside the tent?
I'm going to disagree with that, because I think it's absolutely important, and yes, the government must address those issues. But there are many, many groups around the world that have been affected by government policy. They don't all go around bombing people. They all don't go around, you know, committing terrorist attacks.
We have been bombing as a country. Britain has been bombing Iraq since 1991, and it hasn't stopped. Can you imagine? That's the longest transcontinental war in history, that we've been bombing them, and bombs that we drop over there
I want to know about
kill people.
terrorism in this country.
Yeah.
Really, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
I think...
And I mean, your assertion about torture, I understand where you're coming from.
Every single terrorist act committed by people connected to Daesh or Al-Qaeda, quote, in their videos, in their statements, that we did it because of the war.
Those attacks also caused terrorism in this country as well, and innocent people died.
Of course.
So let's talk about where we can go with this.
Well, the thing is, we can't go anywhere without having an honest discussion. And one of the interesting things about what the good doctor said was that he was very granular in his focus and microscopic focus on the communities here, completely cutting off the issue of foreign policy. Now, every client I've ever dealt with that's been accused of any of these issues, and that's quite a substantial number over the last decade and a half, have always spoken about motivations of foreign policy. Now, if at the end of the day, the people who are either accused of or actually doing these things, terrorism in the UK, their primary motivational factor is actually foreign policy, if you don't talk about that and address that, we're never going to fix the problem. So can I just call BS on the issue of think tanks that have been advising the government since 2000, pouring 1.1 to 1.3 billion pounds into this and just getting it wrong?
The simple question has to be...
Sorry, we've only got a limited amount of time, so I have to step in every now and then. I said we'd get back to the number of prosecutions of right-wing individuals. Of 402 arrests on the National Terror Database 2016 to 2017, only 34 of 402, that is 8%, were flagged as extreme right-wing, even though a third of all referrals were of extreme right-wing groups. Somebody's got it wrong somewhere, haven't they?
Absolutely, and there I would completely agree. I would say, yes, the British government needs to do much more about far-right extremists, about far-left extremists. Again, you've not included any numbers for the far left, and there are many. Radicalisation is much prevalent.
And there could be animal rights groups in this as well.
Indeed, exactly. And we need to look at radicalisation more holistically. We need to stop singling out just Muslim communities. We need to diversify the conversation on that front. I mean, we work with Hindu extremists and Buddhist extremists, and the Muslims being persecuted in Burma. And so we need to bring all of these into the conversation.
I think what a lot of people on this panel are kind of passing over is that for a lot of you, those 400 or 2,000 or so in 2015 and 16 are just numbers. But for like personally, for me, the prevent strategy, the channel that you go through, it can be quite devastating for people that, as young as 6, 7 or 8 years old, when the police come knocking on your door, when Special Constable comes and visits you and questions you on Palestine and Syria and ISIS. It can be quite damaging. And for me personally, and a lot of other people that I know that have been through the process.
On the other hand, you have said to me that there may be a silver lining to the cloud of you being taken in because you've got a place at Oxford, hopefully, which you think came as a result of admiring what you did. You said it helped.
I think what Prevent has done for me personally is it allowed me to, because a lot of the people that are targeted by Prevent are not, dare I say, as confident as I am in opposing the strategy. A lot of people are going to be quiet, and the reason is because they're scared of being targeted by Prevent for speaking about Prevent, and that's exactly
because a lot of them are actually primary school children.
Exactly. Yeah. If you're 7 or 8 years old, you're not going to know what Prevent is, number one, and number two, you're going to be too scared to stand up against your principal or a police officer.
Mosley's book, Enemy Combatant, 2007, given to me as a present. One of the things you wrote in the prologue was one of the more ambitious aims of this book is to find some common ground between people on opposing sides of this new war to introduce the voice of reason, so frequently drowned by the roar of hatred and intolerance. Are we more intolerant? Is there more hatred now than there was when you wrote those words?
Sadly, I was very optimistic when I wrote that. And I did, on the one hand, I've had American soldiers who were my guardsmen come over to my house, visit me, and so forth. But on the other hand, the securitization, the militarization of our police, of our security services in this country has brought us to a place we've never been before. I mean, when you're talking about Simon Cole, who's the head of Prevent. He himself said that I am afraid that we may walk into becoming a thought police in a police state. If the head of Prevent says something like that, if you've got the United Nations themselves who've said recently that Prevent isn't stopping extremism, it could be causing it. And if that's where we are, we're in a far worse place than when I wrote that.
Yeah. Are people listening to suggestions such as that?
Yeah, but again, I mean, to come back to your point, add to your point, as I said earlier, there's macro and there's micro, but people don't just go from the macro foreign policy grievance or anything else to the micro act of aggression, my immediate sense of alienation, my immediate sense of grief, and I need to commit violence. There is a meso between the macro and the micro, and that meso is a radical milieu. There is a facilitating rhetoric, a facilitating support system, logistical support, financial support, moral support, to allowing that process to occur from the macro to the micro, which leads to the radicalisation, but then the acting upon it. So yes, I agree with the macro, the micro, but think about the meso. We need to talk about the meso.
Final thought, if you would, because we've got to wrap this up, unfortunately.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's just myopic to focus on only one aspect. You say there's a milieu of fostering sort of extremism and terrorism, but the fact is that a lot of these attacks are lone wolves picking up a knife or driving their car, which doesn't require any sort of support. And these are the predominant sort of expressions of terrorism that we're seeing now. Everyone has a car, and a difference between somebody who ploughs it in or is a terrorist is just a thought.
Well, thank you all very much indeed. It has been a fascinating discussion. The problems of terrorism are enduring, the pressures to curb them immense. When, for example, does a name on a list become a tangible threat? And could it be that the UK government's efforts are, in fact, making things worse? This has been Roundtable. From me, David Foster, and the rest of the team. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.